England, 1554, Victorian era. The chandeliers of Harrington House blazed with golden light, spilling brilliance across mirrored walls and polished marble floors. The orchestra played a lively quadrille, boughs flashing as strings filled the air with measured gaiety. Silk skirts swept across parquet, jeweled slippers tapped out delicate rhythms, and laughter mingled with the perfume of roses, powder, and wine. London society had gathered in its finest, a spectacle of power, wealth, and youth. Every movement calculated, every smile a mask of ambition. At the crest of the marble staircase, Lady Eleanor Whitmore paused. The weight of 40 years pressed invisibly upon her shoulders. Though her back was straight, her chin high, her expression composed. She had walked into hundreds of ballrooms before, yet tonight the descent seemed longer, heavier, as though each step would measure the distance between herself and the glittering world below. She could feel their eyes before she saw them. The subtle shifting of attention, the murmurs carrying like smoke through the ballroom. 40, someone whispered, half laughing behind a fan. On the shelf so long the dust must have settled. She might as well be a dowager without ever having married, another voice chimed. Such a pity. A handsome fortune once, and she squandered every opportunity. Eleanor heard, though her expression betrayed nothing. Emerald silk clung to her figure with dignified grace, the gown cut with modest elegance rather than daring fashion. Pearls, cool against her throat, gleamed softly, a quiet inheritance from her late mother, chosen tonight not for vanity, but for courage. Her hair, still largely chestnut though touched with silver threads, had been arranged with deliberate simplicity. She refused to die, to deceive, to play at youth. Let them see her as she was. She descended slowly, each step deliberate, her gloved hand resting lightly on the banister. Below, the crowd parted just enough to admit her presence, eyes following with a mixture of curiosity and scorn. The young debutantes sparkled in pastel gowns, adorned with ribbons and flowers, their laughter high-pitched, untroubled by time. Their mothers watched Eleanor with thinly veiled triumph, as if her continued singleness confirmed their own daughter's value. The men, polished in black coats and gleaming waistcoats, glanced her way with detached amusement, some pitying, some mocking, a few with faint regret for chances long past. Lord Ashcroft, his belly straining against brocade, muttered to his neighbour, "A shame she never secured a husband. Once she had looks enough, though never wit enough to use them." His companion smirked. "Wit enough to refuse you, perhaps." They both chuckled, secure in their cruelty. Eleanor reached the final step and stepped onto the marble floor. The orchestra's strains washed over her, yet she heard only the cadence of whispers, felt the weight of every glance. The air itself seemed charged with judgment. She forced her lips into a faint smile, neither warm nor cold. A mask of indifference she had perfected across years of scrutiny. Lady Agatha Marlowe, older by 20 years and unashamed in her spinsterhood, swept to her side with an approving nod. "You hold your head too low, my dear. Remember, they cannot mock what they envy." Eleanor's smile trembled but held. "If envy fuels them, I shudder to imagine their mercy." "They are jackdaws," Lady Agatha declared, her cane tapping smartly against the marble. "Chattering birds who mistake noise for power. Let them clatter. You and I know silence has sharper edges." With that she moved away, leaving Eleanor standing amidst the sea of silk and smoke. The dancing had begun again, couples whirling gracefully across the floor. Her gentleman bowed toward Eleanor, but she sensed courtesy rather than desire, pity rather than pursuit. She declined with a graceful shake of her head. Better to stand alone than accept charity disguised as gallantry. A group of younger ladies nearby burst into laughter, disguising their mockery behind fluttering fans. "Imagine reaching such an age without a husband," one whispered loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. "What is left for her now? Books and embroidery," another added. "Perhaps she waits for widowers too ancient to notice the lines on her face." Their companions tittered cruelly. Eleanor's cheeks burned, though her composure did not falter. She crossed the room toward a side alcove, where a grand mirror reflected the ballroom's splendor. For a moment she studied her own face in the glass. The years had softened her skin, etched faint lines at her eyes, and gentled the sharpness of youth into something quieter, more contemplative. Yet there was dignity in her bearing, clarity in her grey eyes, and a strength born of endurance. Once, long ago, she had been courted by suitors who sought her dowry and admired her beauty. She had refused them, each in turn, waiting for affection more genuine, for a bond of soul rather than mere convenience. But as seasons passed, one by one, her beauty became less currency, her fortune less enticing compared to fresher faces, larger estates. Now at 40, society counted her wasted, her prime consumed, her future empty. Still, she would not regret the path she had chosen. Better solitude than a loveless chain, better dignity than compromise. Yet even as she whispered these truths within her heart, the sting of derision pierced her like thorns pressing through silk gloves. A young man, flushed with wine and boldness, passed near and remarked to his friend, "She walks as though a duchess, yet she reigns over nothing but empty halls." The friend laughed too loudly, and both hurried off before her gaze could reach them. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. The music swelled, violins trembling with joy. Yet to her ears the notes carried sorrow, an echo of the youth she had watched slip quietly beyond her grasp. She opened her eyes to find Lady Beatrice Harcourt approaching, plump and rosy-cheeked, her daughter clinging to her arm. Beatrice curtsied with perfunctory politeness, her smile edged with cruelty. "My dear Eleanor," she cooed, "how very good of you to come tonight. We were quite certain you would remain at home with your novels. Tell me, how do you find the company? It must be strange, after so many years, to see all these young faces beginning their journey where yours has matured." Her daughter giggled behind her fan. Eleanor inclined her head with calm precision. "The company's delightful, Lady Harcourt. Age grants one the perspective to appreciate both the sincerity of youth and the subtleties of maturity. I trust your daughter benefits from both." Her words, polished and cool, carried enough sting that Beatrice's smile faltered. Muttering some excuse, she withdrew, dragging the girl away. Eleanor exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She would not retreat. Not tonight. Each whisper, each glance, each smirk only steeled her resolve. She had entered this ballroom not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to herself, that she remained unbroken, unashamed, unforgotten. The evening stretched onward, glittering and cruel. She moved among the throngs with measured grace, exchanging courtesies, deflecting barbs, enduring the unspoken weight of judgment. And yet, somewhere in the swirl of silk and song, she felt the faintest stirring, a sense that beyond the ridicule, beyond the walls of this ballroom, something waited, something unseen yet approaching. The chandeliers blazed brighter as the night deepened, and though the laughter of her tormentors rang sharp in her ears, Eleanor lifted her chin higher, pearls gleaming at her throat like drops of moonlight. She would endure. She always had. And though she did not yet know it, this night, the night of mockery and scorn, would mark the beginning of a story greater than any of those who whispered could imagine. Understood. I will continue with part 2, written in the same lush Victorian style as before, aiming for 2,000 words, only story. No extra commentary. The carriage wheels rattled softly over the cobblestones as the city's gas lamps flickered in the night. Inside, Eleanor sat in silence, her gloved hands resting in her lap, the faint tremor of her fingers hidden in the folds of her cloak. Harrington House receded into darkness behind her, its glittering laughter still echoing in her ears. Each whisper, each mocking glance seemed to linger, clinging like smoke to her thoughts. The maid who accompanied her leaned forward, fussing with the edge of Eleanor's mantle. "You bore it well, my lady," she said gently. Eleanor offered a faint smile but did not reply. There was little to say. Endurance had become second nature. Silence, a shield stronger than steel. When the carriage drew up before Whitmore House, its Georgian facade loomed in pale stone against the night sky. It was not the grandest of London homes, but dignified, its windows gleaming faintly with lamplight left burning for her return. The butler opened the door at once, bowing low, his face unreadable as she stepped down. Servants never repeated the whispers they surely overheard, yet their silence, too, was heavy, like a mirror in which her loneliness reflected. Eleanor ascended the stairs and entered her drawing-room, dismissing her maid with a quiet nod. The room welcomed her with familiar comfort, shelves lined with leather-bound books, the faint scent of lavender sachets, a fire burning low in the grate. Here at least no laughter mocked her, no glances measured her worth. Here she could remove the mask of composure. She crossed to the mirror above the mantel. Her reflection gazed back, serene, dignified and weary. The silver threads in her hair glinted in the lamplight, reminders of years past, choices made, paths untraveled. She reached to unfasten the pearls at her throat, laying them carefully in their velvet case. They were the last gift from her mother, who had died before Eleanor's 25th year, still hoping to see her daughter settled. "And you will marry for love," her mother had whispered once. "Never for convenience. I wish I had done the same." Those words had guided her through youth. Suitors had come, handsome, titled, wealthy. Lord Fenwick, with his fortune in coal, but his temper sharp as a lash. Mr. Daventry, eager to claim her dowry while boasting of mistresses he had no intention to abandon. Even Sir Robert, charming and gallant, but far more in love with her inheritance than her soul. One by one she had refused them, certain that true affection must lie ahead. Years passed. Her fortune, though comfortable, was no longer the glittering prize it once had been. Her beauty, once admired, was overtaken by fresher blooms. One by one the offers ceased. What had once been her proud principle began to feel like isolation. By 30, whispers had begun. By 35, pity clung to her like a veil. Now at 40, she was spoken of with disdain, as though her refusal to compromise had been arrogance rather than conviction. She moved to her writing desk and opened her journal, its pages filled with neat lines of script. Tonight she dipped her pen into ink and paused. The fire crackled softly. Beyond the windows, London's fog pressed against the glass. She began to write. They mocked me again. The word spinster falls so easily from their lips, as if it were a crime rather than a circumstance. I have lived by choice, yet choice has become my prison. Do I regret? At times, yes. Not the refusals themselves, but the waiting. For what? For love, for honesty, for a man to see me as more than a fortune or a fair face. I waited so long that years slipped past, and now I am judged for daring to wait at all. Her pen scratched furiously across the page, releasing the thoughts she could not speak. She paused, dipped the nib again, and continued. Still, I cannot surrender. To marry now, merely for escape, would be to betray every decision that has defined me. Better to walk alone with dignity than chained by compromise. Yet my heart longs, though it has no right to, for some companion who sees beyond the shell of age and disappointment. Perhaps such men do not exist. Perhaps they never did. She laid the pen aside, closing the journal with trembling hands. Rising, she crossed to the pianoforte that stood in the corner. Music had been her solace since girlhood. She seated herself, her fingers brushing the ivory keys. A soft melody filled the room, quiet, melancholy yet resolute. Notes rose like fragments of memory. Dances long past, laughter once genuine, conversations held under lantern light. For a moment, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine a hand extended in kindness, eyes that saw her, truly saw her. The music faltered. Her fingers stilled. She bowed her head. The clock chimed midnight. With a sigh, she rose, extinguished the lamps, and ascended to her chamber. Alone in the vast canopy bed, she lay wakeful, staring at the carved ceiling above. Tomorrow would bring the same routines, the same whispers, the same endurance. Yet beneath her sorrow stirred a spark, small, fragile, unacknowledged. For though the world judged her forgotten, some part of her refused to believe her story was ended. The next morning dawned grey, London fog drifting thick and low across the square. Eleanor rose early, her maid brushing her hair in silence. She dressed in a gown of dove-grey wool, suitable for the day's errands. After breakfast, she summoned her carriage and instructed the coachman to take her to the charity hospital in Whitechapel. This had become her true calling in recent years. While society mocked her absence from the marriage market, she had given herself to other labours. She visited the poor, brought medicines and books, funded small scholarships for girls who might otherwise never learn to read. Here, among those who suffered, her age mattered little, her singleness less. Here she was useful. The hospital was crowded, as always. Children coughed in corners, mothers nursed sick infants, men injured in factories lay pale upon cots. Eleanor moved among them with quiet authority, carrying baskets of food, offering words of comfort, pressing coins into grateful hands. Her presence brought warmth. Her composure steadied the fearful. One old woman grasped her hand and whispered, "God bless you, lady. You are an angel among us." Eleanor smiled faintly, though the words pierced her heart. An angel, yes, but never a wife, never a mother, never beloved. Still, she squeezed the woman's hand with gentleness. "It is nothing," she said softly. "You deserve far more than I can give." Hours passed in service. When at last she returned home, weary but calmer, she sat once more in her drawing room. The afternoon light slanted through the curtains, pale and cold. She opened her journal again and wrote, "If society sees me as forgotten, let them. Here I am remembered. Here I find purpose." Perhaps this must be enough, yet even as she set down the words, a sigh escaped her lips. She closed the journal, pressed her forehead against her hand, and whispered into the stillness, "But oh, to be seen, to be chosen." The fire crackled in answer, and somewhere beyond the fog-draped city, destiny stirred. The March winds swept fiercely along Grosvenor Square, rattling the bare branches of plane trees and sending ladies hurrying from carriages to doorways with gloved hands pressed against their bonnets. The season was beginning again, that annual tide of dinners, musicales and balls in which London's great families displayed themselves as if upon a stage. Tonight, the playhouse was Lady Pembroke's townhouse, and the company assembled within whispered with unusual excitement. For the Duke of Ashburn had returned. 7 years had passed since Alexander Harrow had last walked these streets. Once he had been a fixture in society, admired for his height, his striking blue eyes, his military service in his youth, and later for the gentle devotion he had shown to his fragile wife. Her death had struck him down like a thunderbolt. At barely 40, widowed and inconsolable, he had departed England with little explanation. Rumour claimed he roamed the palaces of Vienna, debated politics in Paris, wandered ruins in Italy. Others whispered of duels, of lovers, of exile, but no one knew the truth, and that mystery only burnished his allure. Now he had returned, older, marked by silver at the temples, yet possessing the same noble carriage that commanded attention wherever he stood. And unmarried. That word hummed in every drawing room like a struck chord. Eleanor had not intended to attend Lady Pembroke's gathering, but Lady Agatha had insisted. "If you stay away, child, they will say you fear the Duke's shadow. Better to be seen, better to meet him on your own terms. Besides, you cannot remain cloistered forever." And so Eleanor entered the salon, her grey silk gown modest yet flattering, her pearls gleaming softly at her throat. She felt the familiar prickling of eyes upon her, the whispers, the glances, but she had schooled herself to endure them. She moved with dignity among the guests, offering polite greetings, until she found a quiet corner near the pianoforte where she might observe unnoticed. The room was abuzz with talk, but gradually Eleanor's gaze was drawn, as if by gravity, to the figure standing near the hearth. He was taller than she remembered, broader perhaps, his posture erect but not stiff, his expression thoughtful amid the babble around him. Young women clustered nearby, their fans fluttering like butterflies, their voices pitched in hopeful gaiety. He responded with courtesy, but his eyes did not linger on them. There was a distance in his manner, as though his thoughts dwelt elsewhere. As though the attention lavished upon him were less pleasure than burden, Eleanor studied him with the detached curiosity of one long accustomed to observing rather than participating. She recalled him faintly from years ago, standing beside his wife at court functions. Lady Marianne Harrow had been delicate, almost ethereal, her complexion like porcelain. Eleanor remembered once admiring the tenderness with which he had guided her through a crowded room, shielding her from press and noise. When news came of her death, Eleanor had grieved for him in silence, though they had scarcely spoken. To lose love after possessing it, that, she thought, must be a deeper wound than never to have known it at all. Music began, and conversation dimmed. A young soprano performed an aria, her voice soaring sweetly above the accompaniment. Eleanor listened with half an ear, her thoughts straying. It was only when the performance ended and applause rippled through the room that she realized someone had taken the empty chair beside. "Hers, you do not seem to enjoy these gatherings," a voice said quietly. She turned, startled, and found the Duke of Ashbourne seated there. He was close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver threads glinting in his dark hair. His gaze rested on her with steady interest, not the fleeting glance of courtesy, but something weightier, more searching. "I endure them," Eleanor replied after a pause, her tone measured. "Enjoyment is reserved for those with less history." A flicker of understanding crossed his features. "Then we are alike," he said softly. "I endure them also." Before she could answer, Lady Harcourt's daughter swept by, curtsying prettily to the Duke, her eyes wide with hope. He inclined his head politely, but did not rise, and when the girl had passed, his gaze returned to Eleanor. "You are Lady Eleanor Whitmore," he said. "Not as a question, but as a statement." "I am," she replied. "And you are much discussed." His mouth curved faintly. "Discussion has always been more comfortable for others than for myself." The next performer began, but Eleanor scarcely heard. She was aware only of the man beside her, his presence at once unsettling and strangely reassuring. He did not flatter, did not ask the inane questions of society's courtship ritual. Instead, he regarded her as though she were a subject worth contemplating, not a relic to be pitied. When the song ended, he asked, "Do you play?" "At times," she admitted. "For myself, not for an audience." "A wise distinction," he murmured. "I have always thought music truer in solitude." The evening drifted on, and they exchanged words between each performance, brief yet curiously intimate. He asked her thoughts on a poem recently published in the Times, and she answered candidly, surprised at her own boldness. He spoke of his travels in Italy, not boasting but reflecting, describing ancient ruins with the quiet reverence of one who had felt the weight of centuries. She listened, drawn by the depth of his voice, by the sense that he revealed something genuine beneath the surface. At last, the musical concluded, and guests rose to depart. Eleanor gathered her shawl, preparing to leave when the Duke spoke again. "May I escort you to your carriage?" The question startled her. "Surely there are others." "There are always others," he said simply. "But I would walk with you." And so he offered his arm, and she, after the briefest hesitation, placed her hand upon it. They moved together through the throng, heads turning as they passed. Eleanor felt the burn of countless eyes, the quickening hum of whispers. Yet for once the weight of gossip seemed lighter, shielded by the tall figure at her side. Outside, the air was sharp with March chill. Her carriage waited, the lamps casting halos in the fog. He helped her ascend the step, his hand steady beneath hers. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his eyes meeting hers in the lamplight. "I hope we may speak again. These gatherings are tiresome, but conversation such as yours makes them tolerable." She inclined her head, her pulse unsteady. "Perhaps," she murmured. The coachman flicked the reins, and the carriage rolled away. Eleanor sat in silence, her gloved hand pressed to her lap, where his touch still lingered. For years she had walked alone, invisible, dismissed. Tonight, for the first time, she had been seen not as a curiosity, not as a failure, but as herself, and though she told herself it was nothing, that it meant little, A spark long dormant stirred quietly within her heart. The April sun slanted pale across Grosvenor Square, gilding the rooftops in faint warmth, while the air still carried the chill of early spring. Carriages rattled steadily past, their wheels scattering gravel, and ladies in bonnets strolled with parasols tilted just so, determined to display themselves to advantage in the season's first real light. Eleanor observed them from the window of her drawing-room, a book lying forgotten in her lap. Her maid had placed a vase of hyacinths on the table beside her, their fragrance mingling with the faint smoke from the fire, but neither book nor flowers held her attention. Her thoughts lingered elsewhere, on the Duke of Ashbourne, whose unexpected conversation at Lady Pembroke's musicale had unsettled her peace. She had told herself it was nothing, a polite exchange, a courtesy extended to a woman too long overlooked. Yet the memory of his gaze, steady and unhurried, refused to fade. Others looked at her with pity or amusement. He had looked at her as though she were worth listening to, as though her words carried weight. It had been years since she had felt such attention. Her reverie was interrupted by the butler announcing, "Lady Agatha Marlowe." Eleanor rose with a smile as her aunt swept into the room, her cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. "You look thoughtful." "Child," Lady Agatha remarked, lowering herself into a chair with practiced dignity. "Have you been brooding over society's barbs again? You must learn to treat their gossip as one treats the weather, inevitable and seldom accurate." "I was thinking of nothing in particular," Eleanor replied. Though colour touched her cheeks, Lady Agatha's sharp eyes narrowed. "Nothing in particular, indeed. I have lived long enough to know when a woman's thoughts are occupied." "Is it the Duke?" Eleanor started. "Aunt, do not look so scandalized," Lady Agatha said dryly. "Half of London speaks of him already. Why should you be exempt from curiosity?" "I have no claim to curiosity," Eleanor said, turning back to the window. "He is surrounded by youth and beauty. I'm not blind." "Nor is he," Lady Agatha retorted. "And sometimes blindness is what youth and beauty inspire. A man who has lived, who has suffered, learns to see differently. Mark me, Eleanor, there is steel in him, and sorrow too. You may find you are not so invisible as you think." Eleanor did not answer. The thought was too dangerous, too tender to touch. A week later she encountered him again, this time not in a glittering salon, but at a gathering far dearer to her heart, a charity committee meeting held in the library of St. Mary's Hospital. The committee had been formed to raise funds for the education of poor children, and Eleanor had long been its most faithful supporter. She had expected only the usual circle of ladies and a few sympathetic clergymen. Yet when she entered the library, there he was, standing near the long oak table, a sheaf of papers in his hand. Conversation faltered as she approached. The matron introduced him with evident pride. "His Grace has generously offered to contribute to our cause. He has taken a keen interest in the welfare of these children." The Duke inclined his head. "I am acquainted with poverty, though not my own. I have seen it in soldiers under my command, in the streets of foreign cities, in the eyes of children who should have known only play. If my fortune may ease such burdens here, it is my duty to offer it." The sincerity in his voice struck Eleanor like a chord. It was not the grand gesture of a man seeking applause, but the quiet conviction of one who meant what he said. When his eyes met hers across the table, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding too deep for words. The meeting proceeded, figures discussed, plans debated. Eleanor spoke with her usual clarity, outlining the needs of the school and the resources required. When she finished, she noticed the Duke watching her intently, not as a man indulging a lady's hobby, but as an equal considering her counsel. After the meeting, as the others dispersed, he approached. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his tone low enough that only she could hear, "I was struck by your reasoning. You speak not only with knowledge, but with conviction. It is a rare combination." "You are kind," she replied, though her heart quickened. "I have long believed that charity is not a pastime, but a responsibility. If we who have so much do not act, then who will?" He nodded. "I thought the same when I served abroad. Yet many of my peers scoff at such duties. You speak of them as if they were the very measure of our worth. Are they not? She asked softly. For a moment he was silent, his gaze searching hers. Then he said, "Yes, they are." They left the hospital together, the chill wind tugging at Eleanor's cloak. He offered his arm, and she accepted, though her mind whispered caution. The walk to her carriage was brief, yet filled with a sense of intimacy greater than hours of meaningless chatter. When he handed her up the step, his hand lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. That evening, Eleanor sat at her writing desk, her journal open before her. The words came slowly, as if she feared to commit them to paper. I spoke with him again today. He listened, truly listened, as if my thoughts mattered. How long has it been since any man did so? I must guard myself. I'm no girl to be carried away by a glance, a word. Yet I feel something stir within me, long dormant, half forgotten. Is it foolishness or hope? Days turned into weeks, and chance encounters became more frequent. At soirees, at lectures, at charitable functions, she found him near, seeking her out with quiet persistence. Their conversations ranged from politics to poetry, from the ruins of Rome to the streets of London. He never flattered, never trifled. Instead, he asked and listened, and responded with thoughtfulness that disarmed her. Once, walking together in the gardens of Holland House after a lecture, he paused before a blossoming magnolia tree. The air was heavy with fragrance, petals scattered like snow upon the gravel path. "Beauty fades swiftly," he said, brushing a fallen petal from his sleeve. "Yet its memory lingers longer than its bloom." Eleanor looked at him, her heart tightening. "Do you speak of flowers or of people?" "Both," he said simply. "But memory has its own beauty. Do you not think so?" She hesitated, then answered, "Yes. For memory is what remains when all else is gone." Their eyes met, and for an instant the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them standing among the blossoms. She turned quickly, afraid of what might show in her face. That night she could not sleep. His words echoed in her mind, mingling with her own secret longings. She had lived 40 years, waiting for something she scarcely believed possible. Was it possible still? Or was she deceiving herself, mistaking kindness for interest, courtesy for affection? Society noticed, of course. Whispers began, sly comments in drawing rooms. "Ashburn seems to enjoy Lady Eleanor's company. How curious. Surely he intends only courtesy. A duke and a spinster of 40. Impossible. He will marry a girl of 20 with fresh beauty to adorn his title." Laughter followed, sharp and dismissive. Eleanor heard it all, though she pretended not to. Yet when she was with him, the whispers faded. With him, she felt seen, not as a relic, not as an object of pity, but as a woman whose thoughts and feelings had value. Each conversation deepened the bond between them, weaving threads of understanding that neither gossip nor time could easily sever. One afternoon, in the quiet of the British Museum, they stood together before a marble statue brought from Greece. Its features were worn, its limbs broken, yet dignity radiated from its form. "Time has taken much from it," Eleanor murmured. "Yet what remains is more powerful than perfection." He looked at her then, and she felt the weight of his gaze. "Yes," he said. "Much more powerful." Her breath caught, and she turned away, feigning interest in another display. But her heart pounded with a rhythm she had not known for years, and though she told herself to be cautious, though she warned herself against hope, a quiet truth began to bloom within her. She was no longer invisible. The night of the Harrington ball arrived, with all the glittering promise of the season, and with it the sharp edge of cruelty that too often lurked beneath society's polished surface. The mansion's windows blazed with light, carriages lined the crescent, and liveried footmen guided guests up the broad steps into the marbled hall. Music spilled outward, violins weaving merriment into the air. But behind the laughter and silk lay a different anticipation, whispers of a jest prepared at another's expense. Eleanor had considered declining her invitation. A quiet evening by her fire, her books for company, would have spared her the ordeal. Yet she had learned that absence invited as much gossip as presence, and she would not grant her detractors the satisfaction of her retreat. She chose instead a gown of midnight blue satin, dignified and severe, its only adornment the familiar strand of pearls at her throat. When she entered the ballroom, conversations stilled just perceptibly, then swelled again, like waves closing over a stone. She felt the eyes upon her, the sidelong glances, the smirks half hidden by fans. The orchestra struck up a waltz. Couples moved to the floor, the swirl of gowns and black coats forming a kaleidoscope beneath the chandeliers. Eleanor remained at the edge, her hands clasped lightly before her, her gaze steady but detached. She had endured such evenings for years. She would endure this one also. Then came the laughter, high-pitched, too loud, carrying across the polished floor. A group of young women had gathered near the center, their cheeks flushed, their eyes bright with mischief. At their urging, a young man approached the orchestra, whispering something that drew a ripple of amusement among the musicians. With a flourish, the conductor raised his baton, and the violins launched into a lively, exaggerated reel. "Attend, attend!" one of the girls cried, her voice pitched to carry. "It is the spinster's dance!" The words sliced through the room like a knife. Laughter erupted not from all, but from enough. Some smiled behind gloved hands, others chuckled openly. The young women formed a ring, clapping in mock solemnity, and one of them curtsied theatrically toward Eleanor. "Come, Lady Whitmore," another called. "The dance is yours. It was written for you." Heat flooded Eleanor's face, but she did not move. To retreat would be to concede defeat, yet to participate would be degradation beyond bearing. She stood motionless, her spine straight, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. Inside, humiliation burned like fire, the laughter swelled, cruel and merciless. She felt herself shrinking, not in body but in spirit, the years of endurance cracking beneath the weight of ridicule. She thought of leaving, of fleeing the room with what remained of her dignity, when suddenly a figure detached itself from the crowd. The Duke of Ashbourne moved into the circle. His tall form commanded immediate attention, and silence rippled outward as he crossed the floor. Without hesitation he approached Eleanor and bowed deeply. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hush. "Will you grant me this dance?" The room stilled. The mocking girls faltered, their laughter choking into awkward coughs. All eyes turned toward Eleanor, who stood frozen, scarcely able to comprehend what had occurred. Slowly she inclined her head. "I would be honored," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart thundered. He offered his hand, and she placed hers in it. The orchestra, uncertain, faltered in its reel. The Duke turned to the conductor with a gaze that brooked no refusal. "A waltz," he commanded. "Now!" The violins shifted, the melody softened into graceful measure, and the Duke led Eleanor onto the floor. The crowd parted, murmurs rising, but no one dared laugh. His hand was firm at her back, guiding her with ease, his step steady and sure. Eleanor moved as if in a dream, scarcely aware of the music, conscious only of his nearness, the strength in his touch, the unwavering respect in his gaze. Around them, silence deepened. No one intruded upon their dance. The jest had dissolved, the cruelty shamed into retreat by the Duke's simple act. Eleanor lifted her head, meeting his eyes, and in them she saw no pity, no charity, but something far more dangerous, admiration. When the music ended, he bowed again, releasing her hand with grave courtesy. The room erupted in polite applause, subdued, uneasy. The girls who had begun the mockery slipped away, their cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The Duke offered his arm once more. "Shall we?" he asked, and she allowed him to lead her from the floor. Whispers trailed them, but the tone had shifted. Curiosity now mingled with awe. They paused in an alcove where the noise of the ballroom softened. Eleanor drew a breath, her composure fragile. "You should not have done that," she whispered. "Should not." His eyes searched hers. "I could not do otherwise. To mock you was shameful. To honor you was only just. You will draw their censure upon yourself," she murmured. "Let them censure," he said quietly. I have borne heavier burdens. She looked away, afraid of the tumult within her. For years she had steeled herself against cruelty, endured it with silent dignity. Never had anyone stood for her. Never had anyone lifted her from scorn into respect. The gratitude that swelled in her chest was perilous, threatening to spill into something deeper, something she scarcely dared name. The evening dragged on, but its tenor had changed. Where once laughter had stung, now glances carried unease, and whispers bore a new note of speculation. Eleanor endured it with her usual poise, yet beneath the calm her heart beat with unaccustomed strength. When at last she departed, the Duke escorted her to her carriage. The night air was cool, the stars veiled by drifting clouds. At the step she turned to him, struggling for words. "You have given me more than you know," she said softly. He bowed, his gaze unwavering. "Then it is I who am honored." She entered the carriage, and as it rolled away she pressed her hand to her heart. For the first time in many years, the fire of humiliation had been quenched not by silence, but by another's courage. And within her, against all reason, against all caution, hope stirred. The weeks that followed the Harrington ball unfolded with a strange new rhythm, as though some hidden thread had been tugged and the pattern of Eleanor's life altered without her consent. Where once she had been tolerated on the margins of society, she now found herself sought out, observed with a sharper curiosity. The scandal of the mockery and the Duke's decisive intervention had spread quickly through drawing rooms and supper tables. Whispers still followed her. But they were different now, speculative, astonished, tinged with disbelief. Eleanor endured the scrutiny with her accustomed composure, but inside her heart was far from tranquil. Each recollection of that moment on the dance floor, the bow, the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his eyes, returned to her in unguarded hours. She told herself it had been gallantry, nothing more. He had defended her because honor demanded it, not because of any particular regard. Yet the memory pulsed in her like an ember refusing to die. The Duke, for his part, did not retreat into silence after that night. Instead, his presence seemed to multiply in her life. He attended the same charitable meetings, appeared at the same musicales, even strolled through Hyde Park at hours that coincided with her own carriage rides. At first, Eleanor thought it coincidence, but the frequency soon dissolved that notion. He sought her, though never obtrusively, always with courtesy, always with an ease that belied the astonishment of those around them. One afternoon, she encountered him at the Foundling Hospital, where she had gone to inspect the schoolroom built with the committee's funds. The children greeted her with bright smiles, clinging to her skirts, eager to show their lessons. As she listened to a boy read haltingly from his primer, she felt the shift in the room, the sudden hush of awe that spread among the children. Turning, she saw the Duke in the doorway, tall and commanding, his face softened by an unfamiliar gentleness. He entered slowly, speaking to the children with a kindness that astonished her. He asked their names, knelt to meet their eyes, praised their efforts. Eleanor watched, her heart tightening with something she dared not name. Here was no courtly mask, no gesture meant for display. His compassion was real, and it illuminated him more than wealth or title ever could. When the visit ended and the children returned to their lessons, he walked with her through the garden where early roses struggled into bloom. "They trust you," he said quietly. "I saw it in their faces. They look at you not as a benefactor, but as a friend. They have little enough kindness in their lives," Eleanor replied. "If I may give them that, I am content. You give them more than kindness," he said, his gaze steady. "You give them hope. And that is rarer." Her breath caught. She turned toward the roses, unwilling to meet his eyes. "You see too much, Your Grace." "I see enough," he answered. After that day, their paths intertwined more closely. He invited her to accompany him on walks through the botanical gardens, where they lingered among hothouses filled with exotic blooms. He asked her opinions on books he had read abroad, and she was startled to find him quoting passages of philosophy and poetry with genuine enthusiasm. In return, he listened when she spoke of her own passions, the music that soothed her solitude, the essays she penned in private moments, the causes she cherished. One evening, at a lecture on antiquities, they sat side by side in the dim hall. As the scholar droned about Roman mosaics, Eleanor found herself studying the Duke's profile, the way the lamplight touched the silver at his temple, the curve of his mouth. She felt a warmth rise in her that frightened her with its intensity. When he turned suddenly, catching her gaze, she looked away at once, her cheeks aflame. Later, as they left together, he spoke softly. "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" she asked, startled. "Your choice to remain as you are. To wait for love rather than accept convenience," she faltered, uncertain how much to reveal. At last she said, "There are nights when loneliness weighs heavily. Yet I could not have chosen otherwise. To bind myself without affection would have been a prison." He nodded slowly. "I envied you once." "Envied me?" She stared at him. "When my wife lived," he said, his voice low, "I loved her dearly, but duty had arranged our match. Affection grew in time, yet I often wondered what it would be to choose freely, without constraint. You did what many lack the courage to do. You waited. You endured scorn for the sake of principle. That is enviable." His words sank into her like water into parched earth. She walked in silence, her heart swelling with both pain and wonder. To be envied for her solitude, it was a thought she had never imagined. As the weeks slipped by, their bond deepened. They spoke less of society's trivialities and more of their inner lives, of grief, of faith, of the quiet fears that haunted them. He told her of nights in Italy when he had wandered ruins alone, seeking solace and finding only emptiness. She told him of the mornings when she woke in silence, longing for a voice beside her that never came. Their confessions were halting, hesitant, but each drew them closer, weaving threads of trust. One afternoon in May, they strolled through Richmond Park, the air alive with birdsong, the grass emerald beneath the sun. Children ran laughing across the meadows, their kites dancing in the breeze. The Duke paused, watching them with a look of longing. "I might have been a father," he murmured. "You might yet be," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. He turned, his eyes piercing hers. For a long moment neither spoke, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. At last he said, "And you, a mother?" She lowered her gaze, her throat tight. "That path is closed to me now." "Perhaps not," he said softly. "There are many forms of family, many forms of love." Her hands trembled in her gloves. She longed to believe him, yet fear held her back. Hope once awakened could wound more deeply than scorn. That night, alone in her chamber, she opened her journal. Her hand shook as she wrote, "I cannot deny it any longer. He seeks me out. He listens. He speaks as if my worth is unquestioned. Yet what does he intend? Friendship, pity, or something more? I dare not hope, yet hope steals upon me unbidden. If I am deceived, the fall will shatter me. But if I am not..." The ink blurred as her tears fell upon the page. The season advanced, and with it the gossip. Some scoffed, insisting the Duke merely toyed with her. Others whispered more darkly, suggesting she schemed to entrap him. Yet beneath the noise a few began to see what was plain. The Duke and Lady Eleanor were often together, and their companionship bore the unmistakable mark of something deeper than chance. At a supper one evening, Lord Ashcroft leaned toward his neighbour and muttered, "If Ashbourne means to wed, surely he will not waste himself on her." 40 and long past bloom, the Duke, seated within earshot, looked up sharply. His eyes met Ashcroft's, and the older man paled, stammering into silence. The matter was not mentioned again. Eleanor heard of the incident days later, whispered to her by Lady Agatha, who chuckled grimly. "He silences them, child. One word, one glance, and they are mute. That is no small thing. Do you still doubt his regard?" Eleanor did not answer. She feared to speak, lest her fragile hope be crushed by disappointment. And yet, when next she met him and he bent to her hand with a warmth that was almost tenderness, her heart betrayed her. She knew then, with a certainty that frightened her more than ridicule ever had, she was falling in love. The summer season reached its height, and with it the endless whirl of assemblies, dinners, and garden fetes. London glittered beneath long evenings of golden light, yet beneath the sheen of gaiety there stirred an undercurrent of speculation, sharper than any in recent memory. For weeks, society had watched the Duke of Ashbourne and Lady Eleanor Whitmore with mounting fascination. Their conversations at musicales, their walks in parks, their appearances together at charitable committees, none of it escaped notice. What had begun as whispers grew into open conjecture, and the tone was not kind. "He must be trifling with her," murmured Lady Harcourt to her circle one afternoon at Gunter's, her parasol casting sharp shadows across her plump face. "A duke cannot possibly wed a woman of 40. It is absurd. Absurd indeed," another agreed. "Why, my daughter is half that age. If he has sense, he will choose youth. No man seeks silver hair when he might have gold." Their laughter carried down the street, and Eleanor, passing by in her carriage, heard it clearly, despite her maid's attempt to close the window. She sat rigid, her heart aching with familiar humiliation. Yet the pain was sharper now, for hope had made her more vulnerable. The barbs cut deeper, because she could not dismiss them as entirely false. What if they were right? What if she had mistaken courtesy for affection, and the affection of friendship for the flame of love? Still, the Duke did not withdraw. On the contrary, his attentions grew more marked. He visited her home openly, joining her in the drawing-room for tea, speaking with Lady Agatha as though he were already a member of the family. He accompanied her to lectures, escorted her at dinners, and at one garden party stood at her side the entire afternoon, ignoring every attempt to draw him away. The message was plain, yet the world refused to believe it. At Lady Wexford's ball, the tension came to a head. The ballroom shimmered with light, the air thick with perfume and laughter. Eleanor entered in a gown of silver-grey silk, her pearls gleaming at her throat, her composure serene, though her heart was storm-tossed. She had scarcely taken 10 steps into the room when she felt the usual stir, the hush, the sidelong glances, the not-so-subtle pointing fans. But this time, the Duke was there, waiting. He crossed the floor with deliberate ease, his gaze fixed upon her. Conversation faltered around them as he bowed deeply and extended his hand. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "will you dance with me?" The silence that followed was profound. Every eye turned toward them, every whisper stilled. For a heartbeat, Eleanor hesitated, terror and longing warring within her. Then she placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor. The orchestra began a waltz, and they moved together with such harmony that it seemed the music itself bent to their rhythm. Eleanor scarcely felt her feet upon the floor. She was aware only of him, his steady hand, his unwavering gaze, the quiet strength of his presence. The world melted away, leaving only the two of them in the circle of light. When the dance ended, applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling. Though beneath it, Eleanor heard the hiss of speculation, the sharp edges of disbelief. She knew what they whispered, that it was madness, that it could not be, that he must be playing some cruel jest. Her chest tightened with fear, but the Duke did not release her hand. Instead, he kept it firmly in his grasp, turned to face the assembled company, and spoke with a voice that rang clear above the murmur. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "for too long you have spoken of Lady Eleanor Whitmore with scorn, as though her worth were measured by youth or fortune alone. Tonight I will end such talk. I hold her in the highest esteem, not only for her dignity and kindness, but for the strength with which she has borne your cruelty. I am proud to call her my companion, and if she will consent, I would be prouder still to call her my wife." Gasps rippled through the room. Fans stilled, eyes widened, whispers surged like waves crashing upon a shore. Eleanor stood frozen, scarcely breathing, her heart hammering so violently she thought she might faint. The Duke's hand remained steady around hers, his gaze unwavering, waiting for her reply. She could not speak. The enormity of the moment pressed upon her. For years she had been mocked, dismissed, pitied. Now here, before all of London, the most desired Duke had chosen her openly, without shame, without hesitation. And yet fear coiled within her. What if it was pity disguised as devotion? What if she accepted and became the object of ridicule for them both? She felt the weight of 100 eyes, the sharp edge of expectation. Her throat closed, her voice trapped within. At last she managed to whisper so softly that only he could hear, "Why?" His hand tightened around hers. "Because I love you," he said simply. "Not your fortune, not your youth, your soul. I see you, Eleanor, as you truly are, and it is enough. More than enough." Tears blurred her vision. In that instant, the whispers, the stares, the years of humiliation fell away. Only his words remained steady and true. She drew a trembling breath and lifted her head, meeting his eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice clear though her heart shook. "Yes, I will." The murmur of disbelief surged again, but it could not touch her. The Duke bent, pressing her hand to his lips, and the hall erupted into applause. Some genuine, some forced, some tinged with shock. Yet none of it mattered. She had chosen freely and without fear, and in her choice she found strength she had thought long lost. Lady Agatha, watching from her chair, allowed herself a satisfied smile. "At last," she murmured, tapping her cane against the floor. "At last they will learn." That night, as Eleanor sat in her carriage beside the Duke, the city rolling past in shadows and lamplight, she reached for his hand and held it tightly. For the first time in her life, she felt not mocked, not pitied, not invisible, but cherished. And though she knew the whispers would not cease, she no longer feared them. She had endured worse. Now she would endure them with him. And in that knowledge, her heart lifted light as a girl's, strong as a woman's, unbroken at last. The wedding day dawned beneath a sky of soft grey, the kind of English morning that seemed to hold the breath of the world in suspension. A fine mist clung to the streets of Mayfair, beading upon the railings and softening the edges of the great houses. Carriages rattled steadily past, carrying their elegantly dressed occupants towards St. George's, Hanover Square, where the Duke of Ashbourne would wed Lady Eleanor Whitmore. Inside her chamber, Eleanor stood before the mirror as her maid fastened the final buttons of her gown. She had chosen ivory silk, simple and unadorned, its lines graceful rather than ostentatious. A veil of delicate lace framed her face, but her silver-threaded hair shone proudly beneath it. The pearls at her throat, her mother's pearls, gleamed softly as if bearing witness to the moment. Her reflection gazed back at her with quiet wonder. For years she had imagined herself forever outside such rites, a guest at other women's ceremonies, destined never to stand at the center. Yet here she was, at 40, preparing to marry not out of duty or desperation, but from the only reason she had ever considered worthy: love freely chosen. Lady Agatha entered, leaning on her cane, her sharp eyes softer than usual. "You look as though you have stepped out of a painting," she said briskly, though her voice wavered. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Do you approve?" "I approve because you do," Lady Agatha replied, "and because he sees what I have always seen, that your worth was never measured in seasons or suitors, but in the strength of your spirit. Now hold your head high. Let them see they mocked a queen." The bells of St. George's rang out as the carriage carried her through the misted streets. Crowds gathered along the way, curious onlookers pressing forward for a glimpse. Some whispered still, astonished that the most eligible duke in England should marry a woman they had scorned. Yet others cheered, sensing perhaps that they witnessed not scandal, but something rarer, a triumph of love over convention. At the church, the nave was filled with society's finest. Jewels glittered, silks shimmered, and whispers rustled like wind through reeds. Yet when Eleanor entered on her father's arm, a hush fell. The long aisle stretched before her like a river of light, lined with faces that once ridiculed, now watching in silence. She felt their eyes upon her, but for the first time in years she did not shrink. Her gaze lifted, fixed upon the figure waiting at the altar. The Duke stood tall in formal attire, his blue eyes steady, his expression grave yet radiant. When he saw her, his face softened into a smile that banished every whisper, every doubt. In that smile she found courage, Step by step she walked forward, her father's hand trembling slightly against hers, until she stood beside the man who had changed everything. The ceremony began. The words of the liturgy solemn and timeless. As the vows were spoken, Eleanor's voice did not falter. She promised not only obedience, but companionship, not only duty, but devotion. When it was his turn, the Duke's voice rang with certainty, his hand firm around hers. "With this ring," he said, sliding the band upon her finger, "I wed thee, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. But more than goods, more than name, I give you myself wholly and without condition." Tears blurred her vision as she echoed the words, placing a ring upon his hand. When the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife, the bells pealed once more, thundering with joy. The Duke bent to kiss her, not swiftly nor for display, but tenderly, reverently, as though sealing not merely a vow but a truth long known. The congregation erupted into applause, subdued at first, then swelling, though Eleanor scarcely heard it. All the world seemed to narrow to the warmth of his hand, the certainty of his gaze. Afterward, as they emerged into the square, the mist had lifted. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the crowd assembled outside. Cheers rose, hats lifted, flowers were tossed into the air. Eleanor, dazed yet exultant, clung to her husband's arm as they descended the steps together. The wedding breakfast at Ashbourne House was a glittering affair, yet beneath the grandeur lay an undeniable shift. Where once she had been dismissed, Eleanor was now addressed with deference as Duchess. Yet she bore the new title not as a prize won, but as a mantle chosen, and her composure silenced even the sharpest tongues. During the toasts, the Duke rose, lifting his glass. "My friends," he said, though his gaze lingered only on Eleanor, "you have known me as soldier, as widower, as wanderer. But today you know me as the happiest of men. I found a partner whose courage humbles me, whose wisdom steadies me, whose soul has taught me what love truly means. If any among you once mocked her, know this, the jest is on you, for I count myself the most fortunate man alive." A murmur ran through the room, some uncomfortable, some chastened, many moved. Eleanor felt her heart swell with pride and love, tears shimmering in her eyes. She lifted her own glass in silent acknowledgement, her hand trembling in his. When the festivities waned and the guests departed, the house grew quiet. Alone at last, Eleanor walked with her husband through the gardens, the roses heavy with new bloom, the air fragrant and still. They paused by a fountain, its waters glimmering in the twilight. "Do you realize," she whispered, "what we have done?" "Yes," he said, drawing her close. "We have proven that love is not bound by youth, nor silenced by scorn. We have chosen each other, freely against expectation. That is victory enough." She laid her head against his shoulder, the years of loneliness dissolving like mist beneath the rising sun. "For so long," she said, "I thought myself forgotten. Now I know I was only waiting for you." "And I for you," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. As night descended, they returned indoors, the house glowing with lamplight, the future stretching before them like an uncharted horizon. Eleanor paused once more before a mirror, gazing at her reflection. No longer did she see the spinster mocked and pitied. She saw a woman loved, chosen, radiant with dignity, hard-won and joy unexpected. The journey that had begun with whispers and humiliation ended here, not with surrender, but with triumph. The world might still speak, but their voices no longer held power, for she had found in him not only a husband but an equal, a companion of the soul. Hand in hand, they walked forward into their new life, leaving behind the ashes of scorn, carrying only the fire of love that no ridicule could extinguish. And in that fire, Eleanor's spirit blazed, unshakable, free and forever cherished. Team, a walk to remember.